Business news now. The 11th day of protests in France appear to be the most violent yet, even as fewer demonstrators have taken to the streets. Protesters set fire to a Paris restaurant said to be a favorite of President Emmanuel Macron. The demonstrators object to his attempt to reform the pension system by raising the retirement age by 2 years to 64. They're also opposed to the government's bypassing of Parliament to enact the new law and have asked France's highest constitutional body to rule on the legality of the measure. Union leaders say they'll keep up the pressure until the law is reversed.
Our response to it, the pension reform, is this, the protest, and that is what we've told the Prime Minister. If there is no withdrawal of the pension reform bill, we are determined to continue to mobilize. We want to tell him that a President of the Republic cannot govern against the opinion of his country, against the opinion of the people. And that is very serious. He was the President of the rich. He is now the President of chaos. That's very serious.
And that's Sophie Binet, who is Secretary General of the CGT Union. Well, for more on that story and the rest of the day's business news, including some difficult news from Zambia following an IMF review, let's cross over to London and speak to Arise Business correspondent Laurie Laird. Good to see you, Laurie. Pictures out of France looking incredibly dramatic, and it certainly seems as if the protests have taken a more violent turn.
Absolutely, Charles. From the numbers that I have right now, it does look like today got very violent very quickly. And of course, it's still daylight in France. We may see things get worse after darkness falls. But I can tell you that 31 police officers have been injured. Some 17 are actually in hospital, and that's in Paris alone. So we're seeing much, much more violence than we have seen prior to this. And those pictures we saw of Le Romand, which is a restaurant that Emmanuel Macron likes to frequent, really are quite dramatic. Reports of protesters throwing projectiles at the police, reports that many have been detained. And the fear is in France right now that something called the Black Bloc, which is a violent group of far-left protesters, have started to infiltrate, which were rather peaceful protests when these protests started a couple of months ago. This is the 11th protest. Another has been called for the same day next week. So I think we can see more of this continuing.
Well, the unions, Laurie, say they'll keep up the pressure until this new law is reversed. I mean, is there the possibility that they might achieve that goal?
That's the right question, Charles. And there is a possibility that this can be reversed. I think probably the most likely possibility is that Emmanuel Macron, who is off on international duty this week, perhaps he will say, and he's been pushed by some in his party to say, let's put this on hold. Let's have a little bit of consultation to make sure everybody's happy. However, there are some legal routes that the opposition can take. They have asked the highest constitutional council in the land to consider two options, two requests. One is to look at the legality of this. Remember, this law was not passed through Parliament. Emmanuel Macron did not think that he had the support to get this through Parliament. He instructed his government to bypass Parliament, and there is a provision in the Constitution to do this. But the unions and opponents of this bill will ask the Constitutional Council to consider whether that was done in line with the Constitution. Now, the other question that they have is they will ask the Constitutional Council to allow them to hold a referendum, a nationwide referendum on this issue. If the Constitutional Council allows that, the opposition would have to collect the signatures of 10% of the population, and then this would go to a referendum. So there are ways that opponents of this rule can have it reversed. The Constitutional Council will take a look at this on the 14th of April. And as I mentioned, another protest is scheduled for the 13th of April, right before they consider this.
And briefly, Laurie, I mean, the agent provocateur in all of this, of course, pension reform. How urgent is the need for that?
It depends where you are on which side of the argument you are on. Certainly, France spends much, much more GDP on pensions than most other rich countries, about 14% of output, and that's about twice the amount of your average other rich country. On the other hand, a lot of economists say this pension, this pension is working for France. This is something that French people like. So perhaps money can be cut elsewhere to consider to fund pensions at the level that we have been. So jury is out on that, but it is clear that France does spend a lot more on pensions than most other nations.
Well, let's turn to Africa and Zambia. Some rather unwelcome news from the International Monetary Fund.
Honestly, it's really difficult not to have a little bit of sympathy for Zambia here. Zambia is in the middle of negotiating with the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. Zambia has defaulted on its debts. A $1.3 billion package has been agreed, at least in principle, and that is tiny compared to Zambia's debts, which were almost $19 billion. The IMF took a look, reviewed what's going on in Zambia, and said, look, you were doing, and we're looking here at Kamala Harris, Charles, who was in Zambia recently and was also urging a resolution of Zambia's debt problems. But the IMF took a look at Zambia and said, on the one hand, you're doing fantastically well fiscally. You have made sure that spending is under control. You have improved tax collection. The IMF, we're saying you're doing exactly what we asked. However, you need to sort out your bilateral debts. So that's not debts owed to the IMF or to any big multilateral organizations. You have to sort out your debts with China and with France. And until that happens, the IMF is saying we're not releasing any more money. So quite a bitter pill to swallow for Zambia.
Well, absolutely. We'll have to see how they resolve that issue. But very briefly, Laurie, staying in Africa, what do you make of the fall in investment here in Nigeria?
These are extraordinary numbers out earlier in the week. Foreign direct investment into Nigeria down about a third in 2022 over 2021, down almost 90%, Charles, since 2007. And there seems to be one reason for this, and that's the exchange rate. Investors are very apprehensive about the multi-exchange rate, their multi-tiered exchange rate in Nigeria. They're also very concerned about the difficulty in getting dollars out of the country. And so they're saying until that's resolved, despite the fact that Nigeria has so much to offer, we're a little bit concerned about putting long-term money into the country.
Laurie, thanks very much indeed. Laurie Laird, a Rise business correspondent, talking to me there from London.